So, 21 Pilots' story of Dima has come to an end with the release of City Walls and Dragpath. They are finishing out their Clancy tour, the breach leg of their Clancy tour, and preparing to go on a hiatus. And while I'm sure that in a few years, however many it remains to be seen, but perhaps in 2 or 3 years at most, they will return with new music, and a new album, most likely. In the meantime, we are all wondering, what's next for us as fans? Well, for one thing, we can continue to listen to their now vast discography and also continue to explore the story, which they have given us in its entirety, but while finished, it is not wholly explained. So I know I, for one, will continue to do both those things, and I'm sure many of you will as well. But in the meantime, as we wait for fresh music from them, here are 3 other bands which I, in particular, really enjoy, 2 of which are currently releasing new music, and 2 of which also have some pretty interesting and extensive lore behind them. Let's get into it. Now, I'm very picky about what kind of music or which bands I enjoy. There are many musicians and artists who will produce music and I'll listen to a song or two from them and enjoy it. But there are very few, in fact, there are only really 3 or 4, 21 Pilots being one of them, who I'll sit down and listen to and enjoy an entire discography, or at least almost an entire discography of their music. And the 3 bands that I'm going to look at today are 3 such artists. Now, I don't normally say this because it's usually just used as a cheap retention trick, but you're going to want to watch this video all the way to the end, because the band that I cover last is one of the most interesting. And I'll also put links in the description to each of the respective YouTube channels for these artists as I go through, as well as a song or 2 from each one that I would recommend listening to as a starting point. So check those out if you're interested in hearing more from any of these 3. First up, we have a band entitled iDKHOW, or the long form of the name is I Don't Know How, But They Found Me. This is probably the biggest band of the 3, and certainly one which many of you already have expressed some knowledge or interest in the past. And of the 3 that we cover today, this one certainly has the smallest discography, with only 2 albums and 1 EP released. Well, technically 2 EPs, but we'll get into that in a moment. Overall, this band produces some excellent music, especially in their earlier works, and also have, in a much more subtle degree than someone like 21 Pilots, some lore behind what they're doing. I'm going to make a video some point in the future doing a deep dive into the lore behind their music, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that today. But basically, the idea behind it is that they're a lost band, a forgotten act from like the 1980s, and that's why this first EP, their debut release, is entitled the 1981 Extended Play. They're a forgotten act who operated in that time period and then was recently rediscovered and are now being redistributed, although they themselves technically aren't alive and aren't still creating music. At least that's where the lore begins, and it goes from there into sort of a secret government project, a government experiment creating and outputting this music. But that, like I said, is something we'll explore more at a later date. And their most well-known song, the one which you probably would have heard of if you've heard of anything by them, is found on this EP, the song entitled Choke. In fact, it was that song in this EP through which I discovered this band. And then they later went on to release their debut album, really, Razzmatazz. And that you can see pictured here. It is something which many people have asked in the comments, what is that album? It's not a 21 Pilots album. What's this? It's the debut album from this band, Razzmatazz. It's an album which contains 12 tracks if you listen to it on a streaming service, but 14 tracks if you own the vinyl or the CD. Now, these 2 extra tracks are kind of bonus tracks, but they're intermingled among the track list, not just placed at the end. And rather than being songs in and of themselves, they're sort of these spoken word tracks that expand upon the lore and the story that they are telling. So that's something I've always appreciated about this band, is the way in which they encourage and reward the purchase and collection of physical media, and find ways to expand the story out more in a physical medium, especially given the way in which they present themselves as a band, someone who was really operating in the 80s when vinyls in particular were the medium by which people listened to music. Their second album, Gloom Division, was released, I believe, last year in 2024, and I never really got into it. I listened to the entirety of it, but it wasn't really my thing, and the lore seemed to have kind of dropped away. So that's something to bear in mind if you check out and explore this band some more, So it's really the EP and the album that I recommend listening to. But do take a listen to Gloom Division if you like these two, because you might like that album and the style of music it contains. It just wasn't really my cup of tea. Part of this is that the drummer that was part of the band left after Razzmatazz and before Gloom Division was released. So Dallin Weeks, who used to be the bassist for Panic at the Disco, continued the band as a solo project without him. And I think in part that contributed to the decline in quality, but I'm not sure if that's actually why. In fact, the main reason I didn't like Gloom Division is because they kind of just completely abandoned the lore, and it seems like they're not going to return to that story, which makes all the songs feel a little emptier somehow. Now, as I mentioned, technically they released 2 EPs alongside their 2 albums, and one of these EPs came out, I believe, before Razzmatazz was released, and it's entitled Christmas Drag. It contains 3 songs, including a cover of Merry Christmas Everybody, and then 2 other Christmas songs, Oh Noel and Christmas Drag. It's probably not a collection of Christmas music that is for everybody, and being that it is Christmas music, it's a bit harder to include it in their discography of where to get started when checking out this band, because it's not quite Christmas. But it is an EP that I often start playing in late November or early December as we get into the Christmas season. It is not at all lore related, but all 3 songs are pretty well done. Stylistically, I think this is something that many fans of 21 Pilots will enjoy, both musically and lyrically, and then of course there is this story and this lore behind it that you can dive into and unpack and theorize about further, because a lot of it is not explicitly told or explained. In fact, in many ways, it seems like the start of a story, the way they started Trench, sort of cryptic, analog, hidden clues, and found footage, found archives, and things like that. But then they never really go anywhere with it. At least they haven't yet. Perhaps they will in the future. Next up is a band, or perhaps more specifically, an artist named Arrested Youth. He is more of a solo act, although when he performs live, he has a drummer and guitarist and so on who accompany him. But he is a single musician, a single artist, creating under the name Arrested Youth. Now, while he isn't at least currently one of the biggest of these 3, you may have already heard of him because he was one of the openers for 21 Pilots during the Takeover tour. Now, there's no lore behind his music, certainly not anything in the way of world building the way iDKHOW or 21 Pilots have done, but he does have really good music overall, and he does have quite a lot of it, although some songs do kind of dip below that standard, as I'll get into in a moment. Of all the artists I'm discussing today, he has by far released the greatest number of songs, with 3 albums, 4 EPs, and a handful of other singles, and he's currently releasing another EP as we speak. He started by releasing Fear, the debut album, and the album through which I discovered him. In fact, I'm lucky that all 3 of these artists are bands that I discovered pretty close to their inception. Not exactly the same year that they launched their music career, if you will, or released that first release, but I was able to catch all of their second releases as they came out. And Fear is a shorter album, about 9 tracks long, 11 tracks on the deluxe edition, but it is a fantastic collection of songs and a great introduction to him and his music. This was followed by Sobville Episode 1, a saga which is now, 6 years later, being completed, with episodes 2, 3, and 4 coming out over the course of this year. As I mentioned, episode 4 is in the process of being released as we speak. But it was in this first episode that I initially noticed the 2 extremes in his music, because some of the songs on this EP are great, and some of the songs are really poorly written and very crass, seemingly for no reason whatsoever. And it's not just that he swears in his music, although he certainly does. That isn't really so much what I have an issue with, although if you're going to check out his music, do be warned that several of the songs are explicit if that's something you're concerned about. But it isn't that, it isn't profanity so much that is the issue, it's more what he describes and some really crude things that he gets far into detail about. Again, seemingly for no reason. But I would say Fear is a great place to start. It doesn't have any songs like that on that album, and then maybe follow it up with Nonfiction, but skip Ego and 7th Grade. For reference, Nonfiction is his second album, a total of 15 tracks long, 13 if you skip those 2 songs. And that came out in 2021, around the same time he was opening for 21 Pilots. Since then, he released another album at the end of 2024, and then, like I said, this year is releasing 3 more EPs. So, at the end of the day, I would recommend him to 21 Pilots fans, mainly because stylistically there is a lot of overlap. I'd say if you like 21 Pilots, you probably will like a lot of his songs, and he does have a very extensive discography, so even if you don't like everything by him, there still is plenty to choose from. And then finally, remember I told you should wait until the end, we come to the band that is my favorite of these 3. It is a band that I've been sort of teasing for a little while now, and it is the band Jady. Now, some of you may have already heard of this band. I know certainly some fans of 21 Pilots are also fans of this musical act. Interestingly, the lead singer of the band, Jarrett Doherty, was the bassist for Jay Joseph's lineup when he opened again during the Takeover tour alongside Arrested Youth for 21 Pilots. So I think some fans discovered Jay Joseph and then by extension discovered Jady after that. But many of you probably haven't ever heard of Jady because they are by far the smallest of the three bands discussed today, although they are very quickly growing in popularity. And certainly, I said it a moment ago, I'll say it again, and I'll say it again at the end. If you are a fan of 21 Pilots, if you like the style of their music, and you like the story and world that they built, and you like that they did that, just the concept of doing that to accompany music, then you definitely need to check out this band. I cannot stress this enough. In fact, if you have ever trusted or respected any take that I have given on this channel before, trust me when I say this. Do not sleep on this band. Go check them out. They already have around 30 songs released, and they have an entire new album on the way releasing next Friday, entitled Silver. So there's already plenty to listen to, and there's new music right around the corner. And of the three, it has the most interesting and explicit lore. Yes, iDKHOW had some subtle lore behind it, and that is interesting and worth exploring and diving into more, but Jady really has more of a fleshed out story going on behind what they're doing. Although, in some ways, it is a bit more obscure and a bit more subtle than what 21 Pilots did. But again, Jady's just getting started, and they have plenty of time to continue to flesh out the story and expand upon it even further. Now, I have made a video or two in the past exploring the story and their music, so feel free to check those out if you want to get a bit more of an in-depth look at least the beginnings of the story. But again, like I said, there's a new album right around the corner that's exploring the story even more and promises to provide even more context to what is going on, so there's going to be a lot more to unpack very soon. Now, their debut album, The Haze, was released back in 2022. It features many fantastic songs, including one, Inverted Forest, which features Jay Joseph, who I previously mentioned, and who, for those of you who don't know, is Tyler Joseph, the frontman of 21 Pilots, brother. It is probably worth mentioning here that Jady is also from Ohio, and I believe is also from Columbus, Ohio. They recently headlined a performance at the Newport Music Hall. So The Haze is definitely a great place to start, some incredible songs, and it is definitely a concept album that launches you into this world of The Haze. Napalm continues the story with an even better sound, a more mature sound even than The Haze has. It is a fantastic body of work. And it has, in my opinion, the best songs they have released so far, although by the sound of it, Silver is going to have some even better songs on it. But for instance, off of Napalm, you should really check out Napalm, Wallow, Ghost Man, and of course, Frostbite. And then, as I mentioned, their new album, Silver, releases in just a few days, will continue the story, and contains a total of 14 tracks, 4 of which have already been released. Fragile and Shed My Skin being my personal favorites off of those 4. But even among those 4, there is enough variety that there probably is something that you will find you enjoy. Again, if you're a fan of 21 Pilots, I really do think you're going to like this band. And I think the only reason many fans of 21 Pilots aren't talking about this band as another natural place to turn to now that the Dima story is over, it's just simply because they're too small and maybe many people haven't heard of them yet. But conceptually, they're doing something very similar to what we all loved about what 21 Pilots was doing. They have a world that they're building behind some excellent music, and it's not a direct copy of what 21 Pilots were doing. It may have been influenced by seeing what they were doing with Dima and wanting to do something similar. I can't speak to that. I can only speculate that it might have been, but it is very different. It is not a fantasy world of Dima in the same way at all. In fact, it seems to be very much grounded as if it were something that exists in our world, whereas Dima is something that exists seemingly in some other fantasy realm and universe. Silver is also, for the first time for this band, going to be released on vinyl. I've already pre-ordered my copy, and I'm very excited to have another vinyl to add to my collection. And no, as some of you might be getting ready to comment down below, I've not been sponsored or paid for by Jady to say any of this. I'm just a very big fan of their music, and I think they are severely underrated as a band, and I think they really could find an audience of fans among all of you who are also fans of what 21 Pilots have done. With that being said, thank you so much for watching, and comment down below what your favorite song is from each of these bands, if you've heard any of their music before, and also include a song as a recommendation for a starting point for someone who hasn't heard any of their music previously. And of course, as always, don't forget to subscribe for more music commentary and reviews. There's much more coming very soon, and I'm very excited to explore and unpack not only the music from these 3 artists, but also even more from 21 Pilots.